I'm 63 years old, and if anyone had told me 5 years before that September that falling in love again would come this close to costing me everything I had spent 30 years building from nothing, I would have laughed until I cried. I had worked too hard. I was too careful. I knew better. And yet there I was, sitting across from a lawyer in a glass office on Pandosy Street in Kelowna, listening to her explain exactly what could have happened to me if I hadn't kept one very deliberate secret from the man I married. That secret is the reason I still own my property today. My name is Maggie Harlow, though everyone who knows me calls me Maggie. I built something in the South Okanagan that people drive from Calgary and Vancouver to visit. I didn't inherit it. I didn't win it. I built it with decisions that scared me, with money I was terrified to spend, with years I gave up and never got back. And when a man named David Connolly came into my life and made me believe that the loneliest chapter was finally over, I almost forgot the most important lesson that place had ever taught me. Almost. I need to start at the beginning, because none of what happened later makes sense without it. I was 34 years old when I bought the land. It was 1996, mid-July, and the Okanagan heat was the kind that makes the air above the highway shimmer like water. My daughter Claire was 9. Her father and I had separated the year before, and I had walked away with very little some furniture, a used Subaru, and a settlement that covered about 4 months of living expenses if I was disciplined about it. I was a licensed homestager working out of Penticton, which sounds more glamorous than it was. I spent most days hauling furniture and hanging artwork in other people's houses, trying to make their lives look appealing enough to sell. But I had been watching the land market in the valley for 3 years by then. Every weekend, Claire and I would drive the back roads near Okanagan Lake, and I kept my eyes open. I knew that a certain kind of property, the kind with southern exposure, lake view, enough flat space to build on, and enough elevation to catch the evening breeze, didn't come available often. When it did, it went fast. The property I found was 11 acres on the eastern bench above Skaha Lake. The seller was an elderly man whose wife had recently passed and who had no interest in maintaining it alone. There was nothing on it but an old irrigation line, some wild sage, and the most stunning view of the lake I had ever seen in my life. I offered him $148,000. He took it. My mother thought I had lost my mind. My sister said I was going through something and should speak to someone. My bank manager approved the loan with a look on his face like he was doing me a personal favor and expected to be proven right about his doubts within the year. The mortgage payments were $1,100 a month. I was making roughly $2,800 take-home at the time. I will not pretend those early years were romantic. They were terrifying. Claire and I lived in a rented house in Penticton, and every dollar I wasn't spending on her went toward that property. I drew the plans for a small guest house myself, sitting at the kitchen table after she went to sleep. I took a second job on weekends doing property photos for a real estate office. I drove out to the land every Sunday, walked the perimeter, and tried to imagine what it would become. The first structure I built was a single-room cabin, nothing more than a shell with a wood stove and a sleeping loft, which I rented out on weekends through word of mouth and a hand-painted sign at the bottom of the hill. By Claire's birthday that first fall, I had made back enough to pay 3 months ahead on the mortgage. By the time Claire started high school, there were 4 cabins on the property. I had taken a business development course through Okanagan College, renegotiated my mortgage twice, and incorporated a small company called Skaha Bench Properties Incorporated. By 2005, I had added a main lodge building with a kitchen and a great room that could host events. I started taking wedding bookings. I hired a part-time groundskeeper. The insurance alone was a headache, but I managed it. By 2010, Harlow's Lakeview Retreat had 14 guest accommodations, a culinary herb garden, 3 permanent staff, and a reputation in the BC tourism industry that I was genuinely proud of. Travel media had written about us. I'd been nominated for a provincial tourism award. The property had been appraised at just under $4 million. The business itself was profitable. Not wildly, hospitality never is, but honestly and sustainably profitable. Do you know what it takes to build something like that as a single woman in rural British Columbia? The seasons when every booking cancels because of wildfire smoke and your revenue drops by 60% and you still have to make payroll. The winters when the pipes freeze and the repair bill is 3 times what you budgeted. The years when you are doing the job of 4 people and smiling at guests while your back aches and your accounts are tighter than they should be. The negotiations with suppliers who assume that because you are a woman alone, you don't know what a fair price is. Every acre of that view, every stone on that pathway, every lamppost, every garden bed, every piece of furniture in every cabin. That was me. Claire had finished her degree in recreation management at UNBC and had taken a position with a resort company in Whistler. She had her own life, her own ambitions, and I was proud of her beyond what I know how to say. She didn't want the retreat, she had told me gently, but honestly, when she was 26, I understood. She had watched me build it, and she knew exactly what it cost. She wanted something that was hers, not a continuation of mine. That made sense to me. So, by the time I was 60, the property was thriving, Claire was settled, and I was, if I am being honest with myself, profoundly lonely, not unhappy. There is a difference. I had built a full life. I had friends, a community, work I believed in. But the evenings were quiet in a way that had started to feel less like peace and more like absence. I met David Connolly at a regional tourism conference in Kelowna in the spring of my 61st year. He was sitting 2 rows ahead of me during a panel on sustainable hospitality, and he had the kind of posture that suggests someone who has always moved through rooms with a certain ease. We ended up at the same table during the networking lunch. He was recently retired, he said, from a commercial property management company based in Edmonton. He had moved to Kelowna the previous year, looking, as he put it, for a softer pace and better light. He was charming in a way that felt effortless rather than practiced. He asked good questions and listened to the answers. He was 66, widowed 4 years earlier, and he spoke about his late wife with a kind of measured tenderness that I found genuinely moving. By the end of the afternoon, we had exchanged numbers. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. In that time, I introduced him to Claire, who was polite but quieter than usual when I asked her what she thought of him afterward. She said she liked him fine. I didn't press her. What I did not do, and this is the part that I look back on with both regret and relief, was run a background check before we became serious. I had the instinct. I even looked up his name online a few times and found nothing concerning. But I didn't hire anyone. I didn't ask my accountant to dig deeper. I told myself that was the kind of suspicious thinking that would keep me alone forever, and I let it go. He had 3 adult children from his first marriage. His wife had passed. Not that marriage. There had been a first wife, I learned gradually. His oldest son, Trevor, was 41 and worked in commercial real estate in Calgary. His daughter, Sandra, was 38, lived in Kelowna, and described herself as a lifestyle consultant, though I never understood precisely what that meant. His youngest son, Kyle, was 34 and had been moving between cities for years, working in sales of various kinds. I met them as a group for the first time at a dinner David hosted at a restaurant downtown, about 8 months into our relationship. They were all well-dressed, personable enough on the surface, and they all asked me the same question within the first 20 minutes, in slightly different formulations. Trevor asked it most directly. We had been talking about the tourism industry in BC, and I mentioned the retreat, and he smiled and said, "That property up on Skaha Bench, how many acres is that?" I told him 11. "And you own that outright? No partners?" I said I had incorporated and that the business structure was fairly straightforward. I kept it vague. He nodded and moved on, but I noticed him glance at Sandra. Sandra asked hers later in the evening. She wanted to know if the retreat was seasonal or year-round. I said year-round, reduced programming in winter. She said it must be wonderful to have something like that to fall back on, as though it were a hobby I had stumbled into. I smiled and said it had taken most of my adult life to build. Kyle asked about real estate values in the South Okanagan, specifically around the lake. General conversation, he framed it, but it wasn't general conversation. It was a different entry to the same room. I noticed all of this. I said nothing to David that evening because I wasn't sure how to say it without sounding paranoid after one dinner. But I noticed, 2 weeks later, David and I were on a walk along the KVR trail, and I told him, gently, that the questions his children had asked about the property had felt a little uncomfortable. He laughed, not unkindly, but dismissively. He said they were just curious, that they came from a business background and asked those sorts of questions naturally, that I shouldn't read into it. He kissed the top of my head and changed the subject. That was the moment. I didn't know it then. Not completely. But something in me filed it away. I had already decided, weeks before that conversation, not to tell David the full picture of my financial situation. It wasn't a dramatic decision at the time. It was more like a quiet, practical one. I had run my business for 30 years on the principle that you don't share information you don't have to share. I had a lawyer, an accountant, a corporate structure that separated my personal assets from the operating business. I told David I owned a property with a hospitality business on it and that it was doing well. I did not tell him that the land alone had been reappraised at $5.2 million. I did not tell him that I held it free and clear, the mortgage paid off in 2014. I did not tell him about the investment account my accountant had quietly grown for me over 15 years. He never pressed me, which in retrospect I understand better now. Pressing me would have been a tactical error on his part. We married in October of that year. A small ceremony at a vineyard near Oliver, 30 guests. Claire in a dusty blue dress reading Mary Oliver by the water. It was genuinely beautiful. I was happy. I believed in it. David moved into my house in Penticton. I had always kept a separate residence in town, a personal preference. The retreat was for guests. We settled into a life that felt, for the first 4 months, like what I had been hoping for. Then the requests started. It began with Trevor calling David, and David relaying the message over dinner one evening that Trevor was putting together a real estate investment syndicate in Alberta and was looking for a few trusted family investors, initial commitment around $80,000. Low risk. 18-month term. David said it casually. The way you mention an interesting opportunity, not the way you ask for something. But we had been married 4 months and he was describing $80,000 of money he didn't have. The implication was clear. I said I wasn't in a position to put capital into something I hadn't reviewed thoroughly, and that I generally didn't invest outside of my own business and established vehicles. David nodded. He didn't argue. He brought it up twice more over the following month, each time slightly differently angled. The third time, I said directly that the answer was no. He went quiet for the rest of the evening. The next thing was Sandra. She called me directly. She had my number from a group chat David had set up and asked if I had ever considered bringing in a hospitality consultant because she had experience in the sector and would love to talk about what she could offer the retreat. I thanked her and said the operation was running well and I wasn't looking to expand the team. She sent a follow-up email with a proposed services agreement. The monthly retainer she quoted was $4,500. I forwarded it to my accountant without comment. She called me back and said, "Maggie, do you know this person?" I told her it was my husband's daughter. There was a pause. Then she said, "Okay. What would you like to do?" I said I would handle it. Kyle came to visit that spring. He stayed in one of the guest cabins I had offered. It seemed natural, and on the second morning, he came to find me in the lodge while I was going over the season's bookings. He sat down across from me with the easy confidence of someone who had rehearsed what he was about to say. He told me he had been thinking a lot about the Okanagan market, that the short-term rental sector was exploding, that a property like mine was sitting on potential I might not be fully realizing. He said he had been talking to some investors who were specifically looking for established properties with existing infrastructure in the lake corridor, and that if I was ever open to a conversation about a joint venture or a partial stake sale, he had people who would be very interested. I put down my pen. I looked at him for a moment. I said, "Kyle, this is my business. It's not something I'm interested in selling, partially or otherwise. I appreciate you thinking of me, but this conversation is closed." He said he understood. He left the following morning, a day ahead of schedule. That evening, David and I had the most direct conversation of our marriage. I told him what had happened. I told him about Sandra's retainer proposal. I told him I had not forgotten the dinner where all 3 of his children had spent an hour asking questions about my assets. David's response was measured. He said he hadn't known about Kyle's visit or what he'd said. He said Sandra had been going through a difficult financial year, and he had perhaps mentioned that I ran a successful business, and he was sorry if that had created an uncomfortable situation. He said Trevor was his son, and he believed the investment opportunity was legitimate. He said he felt I was treating his children as suspects when they were family. He used that word. Family. I did not say what I was thinking. I said I understood he felt protective of his children, and that I needed him to understand that what I had built was not communal property, and that I needed his support in maintaining that boundary clearly. He said he would speak to them. Things were quieter for a while after that, but quiet, I had learned over 30 years of running a business, is not the same as resolved. The following February, David mentioned, over a Saturday breakfast, that he had spoken to a financial planner, not my financial planner, someone new about estate planning, and that the planner had suggested that for tax efficiency, some of our assets might be better held jointly. He said he thought it might be worth exploring. He said it was just an idea. I looked at him across the kitchen table. I thought about that first dinner, about Trevor's smile and Sandra's glance. I thought about Kyle in the lodge with his easy confidence. I thought about the morning in 2003 when I had stood in the mud at 6 a.m., hammering in the footings for the second cabin because I couldn't afford to wait for the contractor who had canceled on me. I thought about what it had cost. I said nothing that morning, but that afternoon I called my lawyer. Her name is Patricia, and she had been my corporate counsel since 2007. I told her everything, from the dinner to the estate planning suggestion. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "I want you to do something for me before we talk strategy. I want you to let me put someone on David Connolly." I asked her what she meant. She said she had a private investigator she trusted, and she wanted 2 weeks, and she thought I should know what I was dealing with before I made any decisions. I said yes. What the investigator found took my breath away. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was so methodical. David had been married twice, not once. His first marriage, to a woman named Gail, had ended in divorce in 2001. The settlement had left Gail with a significantly reduced share of assets they had accumulated together during a 15-year marriage, largely because the matrimonial home and several investments had been quietly restructured into a numbered company in the 2 years preceding the separation. The divorce records were sealed, but the corporate filings were public, and the pattern was clear if you knew where to look. His second wife, the one he had described as his late wife, the one he had spoken about with such measured tenderness, had died in 2019 after a 3-year illness. She had been substantially wealthier than David when they married. Her estate, which by all accounts had been intended to pass primarily to her daughter from a previous relationship, had been significantly restructured in the final 18 months of her life. A power of attorney had been granted to David roughly a year before her death. Her daughter had contested aspects of the will. The legal proceedings had been settled quietly, confidentially, and apparently not in the daughter's favor. Trevor was a real estate agent in Alberta. He had been named in a civil complaint related to a property syndicate that had underperformed significantly and allegedly misrepresented its risk profile. The complaint had been settled. Sandra's lifestyle consulting company had been incorporated 2 years ago and had one registered client. It had applied for a provincial small business grant and been denied. Kyle had declared personal bankruptcy in 2020. I read the investigator's report, sitting in my car in the parking lot outside Patricia's office. I read it twice. Then I sat there for a while and looked at the mountains. I called Claire that evening. I hadn't spoken to her about any of it, not wanting to alarm her before I knew what I was dealing with. I told her everything. There was a long silence on the phone, and then she said quietly, "Mum, what do you need?" I told her I needed to know what she had thought of David the first time she met him. She said, "I thought he was very good at making people feel seen." I asked her why she hadn't said anything. She said she hadn't been sure. She said I seemed happy. She said she was sorry. I told her not to be. I told her it was my decision and I had made it with open eyes, and now I was making a different one. The divorce was not contentious, which I believe was a function of the fact that David had been very careful never to put his intentions into writing, and that my assets had never at any point been jointly held, co-signed, or in any way accessible to him. My corporate structure had kept Skaha Bench properties entirely separate from anything that could be characterized as matrimonial property under the BC Family Law Act. My house in Penticton, which I had also held through a numbered company since 2011, was similarly protected. He had been my husband for 14 months. When Patricia walked him and his lawyer through the asset situation, I am told there was a significant silence in the room. Everything he had been positioning toward, everything his children had been probing for over the course of 2 years, had been, from the beginning, behind a door he never had a key to. He did not contest the divorce. It was finalized 8 months later. I sat with Patricia afterward in her office, and she asked me when I had decided not to tell him the full picture of my finances. I told her it had never been a dramatic decision. I told her that 30 years of building something on your own teaches you that information is not something you give away, that trust is something you verify, and not just something you extend, and that the instinct that had kept the retreat alive through every difficult season was the same one that had quietly kept my mouth shut at a dinner in Kelowna when a man's grown children smiled across a table and started asking, questions. She nodded and said, "You saved yourself." I told her I had been saving myself since 1996. There are things I wish had gone differently. I wish David had been who I thought he was, at least partly. I wish the loneliness of that chapter had not made me so willing to see what I wanted to see. I wish I had listened more closely to the silence after Claire met him for the first time. I wish I had hired the investigator before I married him, instead of after. And I think about the women who don't. The women who are 60, or 65, or 70, who have spent decades building something real and quiet and theirs, and who meet someone warm and attentive and are so grateful for it that they open every door. I think about David's first wife, Gail, and what she walked away with after 15 years. I think about the daughter of his second wife, who went to court and lost. I think about an elderly friend of my neighbor's who fell in love with a younger man and spent the last years of her life watching her estate quietly rearranged around her, and who refused every warning, and who died believing she was loved, and whose family had to live with what came after. Be careful. That is not a cynical thing to say. It is not a sad thing either. It is the thing that I wish someone had said to me, plainly, before that autumn in Kelowna. Before you share your life with someone new, share it with a lawyer and an investigator first. Not because love is not real, sometimes it is, but because what you have built is real too, and it deserves the same due diligence you gave it when you were 34 years old, and the bank manager was looking at you like you were going to fail, and you built it anyway. I went back to the retreat the week the divorce was finalized. It was late April, the orchard on the neighboring property just beginning to show blossom, the lake that particular shade of deep green that only happens in early spring when the light is still low. I walked the full perimeter of the 11 acres, the same way I had when it was raw land and scrub sage, and the most audacious bet of my life. My groundskeeper, James, met me at the top of the hill. He'd been with me for 11 years by then. He asked if everything was all right. I told him everything was exactly as it should be. He nodded and went back to work. I stood there for a while, looking at the lake, at the cabins, at the stone path that ran between them, at the garden that would need another 2 weeks before it was ready to open. I had built this. I had protected it. And it was mine. It still is.